If you dare to explore the darkest mysteries, subscribe now to Ghost Whispers. The albino buck and graveyard horrors. It started with the albino buck. I'd seen it once before, about a year ago, but it was just a fleeting glimpse in the woods behind my house. It didn't feel like anything strange at the time, just one of those rare, lucky sightings you tell your friends about. But last week, I saw it again, and this time, it wasn't just passing through. It was standing at the edge of the forest, right where the trees meet my backyard, completely still. Its pale, almost glowing coat seemed to shimmer under the moonlight, and its eyes were the weirdest part. They didn't look like normal deer eyes. They were almost human, dark, focused, and somehow too aware of me. It stared for what felt like forever before finally turning and walking back into the woods, slow and deliberate, like it wanted me to follow it. I didn't think much of it that night, but the next morning, my neighbor knocked on my door, looking more frantic than I'd ever seen him. He was asking if I'd seen his dog. A big German shepherd named Max. Max never wandered off, but he hadn't come back after being let out the night before. I hadn't seen or heard anything unusual, so I told him no and promised to keep an eye out. Over the next couple of days, though, things started to escalate. Another neighbor lost their cat, and then someone posted on the local Facebook group about 2 missing goats from a small farm down the road. It wasn't just animals disappearing, either. People started finding strange things in their yards. Tufts of fur, bones that didn't look like they belonged to any animal we knew, and once, someone even claimed they found a claw. By the third night, I was on edge. I couldn't shake the feeling that the albino buck had something to do with it. I know it sounds crazy, but I couldn't get those eyes out of my head. I started leaving the porch light on and kept my dog, Rosie, inside no matter how much she whined to go out. Around midnight, I heard it, the sound of hooves on the driveway. I peeked out the window, and there it was again, standing under the glow of the porch light, staring directly at the house. This time, it wasn't alone. Behind it, just barely visible in the shadows of the trees, were more deer, dozens of them, all motionless like statues. My heart was racing. I swear to God, the albino buck nodded at me before they all turned and melted back into the woods. The next morning, I decided to walk the edge of the woods, looking for any sign of Rosie's leash, toys, anything she might have dropped from our usual walks. I figured it would also help clear my head. About 15 minutes in, I noticed something strange. Shallow holes dug into the dirt. They were too precise to be natural, almost like graves, but they weren't deep enough to bury anything. I counted at least 8 of them before I saw what was inside one. A pile of feathers, bloodied and scattered, like a bird had been torn apart. Another hole held a half-buried rib cage, small and delicate, like it belonged to a cat or a fox. I didn't want to look anymore. I turned back toward the house, but before I could leave, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. It was the buck, standing farther into the trees. This time, though, it didn't feel like it was just watching me. It felt like it was waiting. I didn't tell anyone about what I'd found in the woods. Honestly, I wasn't even sure how to explain it without sounding like I'd lost my mind. But the holes kept nagging at me, especially the fact that they seemed deliberately placed. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the buck and those empty graves. Around 2 a.m., I gave up trying and decided to distract myself by scrolling through my phone. That's when I heard Rosie growling. She was standing at the back door, fur bristling, staring into the yard. I grabbed a flashlight and reluctantly stepped out onto the porch. The air felt colder than usual, and it was dead silent. No crickets, no rustling leaves, nothing. Rosie started barking like crazy, and that's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was a tree branch swaying in the wind, but when the flashlight caught it, I realized it was an antler, one of the albino bucks. It was barely visible, peeking out from behind a tree at the edge of the woods. Rosie's barking got more frantic, and I had to hold her collar to keep her from bolting off the porch. The buck stepped out slowly, and once again, those dark, unnerving eyes locked onto mine. But this time, its mouth was open. I know it sounds insane, but it looked like it was smiling, or at least baring its teeth. Something about the way it moved felt unnatural, jerky, like it was trying to mimic something it didn't quite understand. I don't know why, but I felt frozen, like I couldn't move even if I wanted to. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it turned and darted back into the woods. The next morning, I couldn't ignore it anymore. I decided to follow the buck's trail, even though every part of me screamed not to. Armed with nothing but a flashlight and a stupid sense of curiosity, I headed back to the woods. I figured I'd look for fresh tracks or maybe those shallow graves again. But as I went deeper, the forest felt wrong. It was quiet, eerily quiet, like the kind of silence that presses against your ears and makes your heart pound louder. After about 20 minutes, I came across a path I'd never noticed before. It was narrow and overgrown, but something about it felt intentional, like it had been made for someone, or something, to follow. The path led to a small clearing, and that's when I saw it. A graveyard. Not an official one, just rows of crude, hand-dug graves marked with sticks and stones. Some had rotted wooden crosses, others had nothing at all. The air smelled rancid, like wet decay. I wanted to turn back, but my eyes were drawn to the center of the clearing. There was a pile, no, a mound, of bones. It wasn't just animal bones, either. Among the shattered rib cages and broken skulls were things I knew had to be human. A few still had scraps of dried flesh clinging to them, and I felt bile rise in my throat. Then, I saw it, wedged between two larger skulls. There was a smaller one, clean and pale. A child's skull. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at that pile of bones, but something snapped me out of it, a low, guttural noise that came from somewhere deep in the woods. It wasn't a growl exactly, but it had weight to it, like it vibrated through my chest. I shined the flashlight around wildly, but the beam felt weak, swallowed by the darkness around me. That's when I saw movement, just a flash of white against the black trees. The buck. It was circling the clearing, slow and deliberate, but it wasn't alone. Shapes moved with it, slipping in and out of the shadows. At first, I thought it was more deer, but as my eyes adjusted, I realized these things were wrong. Their legs were too long, their backs hunched, and their heads. They were too small for their bodies, with faces that didn't look like animals at all. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over one of the graves. That's when I felt it under my foot. Soft, wet, and warm. I looked down and saw fresh dirt spilling over a partially uncovered body. It was an animal, or at least it used to be. Its torso was split open, organs missing, but the head was intact. It was a dog. My neighbor's dog, Max. I could recognize his collar, now filthy and frayed. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut, and before I could stop myself, I retched onto the ground. The low noise came again, closer this time, and I felt eyes on me, dozens of them. I turned the flashlight toward the shapes in the trees, and for the first time, I saw them clearly. Those weren't animals. They were something else entirely, and every instinct I had told me to run. I didn't think, I just ran. The flashlight bounced in my hand, casting wild, shaky beams of light that only made the forest seem more alive. Branches scratched at my arms and face, and the cold air burned my lungs. Behind me, I could hear them, footsteps or maybe hoofbeats, pounding against the ground, but they didn't sound normal. They were too fast, too erratic, like something was stumbling and lurching through the trees. I didn't dare look back. The only thing in my head was one desperate thought: get home. The sound of chasing grew louder, closer, and just as I thought I'd feel something grab me, everything went silent again. Completely silent. I skidded to a stop, chest heaving, flashlight trembling in my hand. I whipped around, expecting to see them right behind me, but there was nothing. Just darkness and the faint outline of trees. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears, pounding so hard it hurt. I backed away slowly, and that's when I saw it. Standing in the path ahead, between me and my house, was the albino buck. Its head was tilted slightly, like it was curious, but its body looked tense, ready to spring. I tried to scream, but nothing came out. I didn't know what to do. The buck just stood there, blocking the path, staring at me with those unsettling eyes. Its pale coat almost seemed to glow, making it look more like a ghost than a living creature. My legs felt like lead, but I forced myself to take a step back. That's when it moved. Not toward me, though. It turned its head sharply to the side, like it was looking at something just behind me. I froze. I hadn't heard anything, but whatever was there made the buck's body stiffen, like it was ready to fight or flee. My stomach dropped, and I slowly turned my head to look. At first, I didn't see anything, just the darkness of the woods. But then, I saw them. Two glowing eyes, much higher off the ground than they should have been. They blinked, and I realized they weren't eyes at all. They were something reflective, like the way a predator's eyes glow when caught in headlights. The shape they belonged to was massive, hunched, and wrong. Its limbs were too long, and its movements were jerky, like it wasn't used to its own body. The creature stepped forward, just enough for the faint beam of my flashlight to catch the outline of its face. It wasn't human. It wasn't animal. It was something I can't even describe, and the second I saw it, I knew I wasn't supposed to. I don't remember making the decision to run. 1 second I was staring at that thing, and the next I was sprinting through the trees, adrenaline drowning out everything else. My mind was blank except for the overwhelming urge to get away. I could hear it behind me, crashing through the underbrush, its movements erratic but fast. So much faster than I thought something that size could move. I didn't dare turn around. My flashlight caught glimpses of the forest floor, roots, rocks, scattered patches of leaves. I knew if I tripped, it would be over. When I finally saw the edge of the woods, my chest tightened with relief. My backyard was just a few steps away. I practically threw myself out of the tree line and onto the lawn, stumbling and nearly falling. But when I looked back, expecting to see that thing barreling after me, there was nothing. The woods were dark and still, almost like nothing had been chasing me at all. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely unlock the back door. I slammed it shut and locked it, then collapsed onto the floor, gasping for air. Rosie was whining in the corner, her tail tucked between her legs. She wouldn't come near me, even when I called her. That's when I realized I still wasn't safe. I sat there on the kitchen floor, trying to catch my breath, when I noticed something strange. The house felt too quiet. No hum of the fridge, no ticking of the old clock above the sink. Just silence, like the kind I'd felt in the woods. My stomach dropped. I didn't want to move, but I forced myself to stand and check the locks on every door and window. Everything was secure, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Rosie stayed glued to the corner, her ears pinned back, eyes fixed on the back door. That's when I heard it. A single knock. Not loud, but deliberate. It came from the back door, the one I just locked. My whole body went cold. There was no way anyone could have been back there, not without me seeing them. I stared at the door, waiting for another knock, but instead, there was a sound like something scraping against the glass. Slowly, I crept toward it, my heart pounding so hard I thought I might pass out. When I was close enough to see, I wished I hadn't looked. The albino buck was standing there, its face pressed against the glass. Its dark eyes seemed even blacker now, almost empty, and its breath fogged up the window in slow, deliberate huffs. Behind it, just barely visible in the darkness, were more shapes, all of them standing perfectly still, watching. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at that thing on the other side of the glass. Its eyes seemed to drill into me, like it knew exactly what I was feeling. Fear, helplessness, disbelief. I wanted to run, but there was nowhere to go. Then, slowly, the buck tilted its head, the same strange, almost human motion I'd seen before. It didn't move otherwise, but the scraping sound started again. I realized it wasn't its antlers or hooves, it was its teeth, dragging across the glass. That's when I noticed something even worse. The shapes behind it weren't just standing there anymore. They were moving closer. Not walking, but twitching, like marionettes on strings. The longer I stared, the more I saw them for what they were, half-formed things, with bodies that didn't make sense. Too many joints, faces that seemed to stretch and shift in ways that defied anatomy. They crept closer to the house, circling it like predators closing in on prey. The buck didn't move, though. It stayed fixed on me, its head now pressed against the glass, as if waiting for something. I grabbed Rosie and ran upstairs, locking myself in the bathroom. I sat in the bathroom with Rosie, clutching her tight while she whimpered softly against my chest. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what was happening, but there were no answers. Only the suffocating reality that whatever was outside wasn't going away. I could hear faint noises from downstairs. The scraping had moved to the walls, like claws or antlers dragging along the siding, and every so often there was a soft thud, as if something was testing the doors or windows. I thought about calling someone, but my phone was still on the kitchen counter, and even if I had it, what could I say? The noise suddenly stopped. The silence was worse than the sounds. I strained to hear anything, but it was like the entire house was holding its breath. I thought maybe they'd gone, that somehow, whatever they were had decided to leave me alone. I was wrong. The bathroom window rattled violently, and Rosie let out a sharp bark. I whipped around just in time to see something press against the frosted glass. It wasn't the buck, it was something else. A hand, or what looked like a hand, scratched at the window. The fingers were too long, too thin, with joints that bent the wrong way. I backed into the corner, holding Rosie tighter as the scratching grew more frantic, and then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. I stayed in the bathroom for what felt like hours, frozen, listening for any sign of movement. But after the scratching stopped, there was only silence. Rosie had stopped whimpering, too, her body tense but calm, like she was waiting for something. I eventually worked up the courage to crack the bathroom door open and peer out into the hallway. Nothing. The house was as still as a tomb. I crept downstairs, heart pounding with every step, clutching a heavy flashlight like it would actually help if anything was still there. When I reached the back door, my breath caught. The glass was fogged with condensation, smeared with streaks where the buck's face had been pressed against it. But outside, there was nothing. No movement, no shapes in the yard, nothing unusual. The woods beyond the yard looked dark and empty, just as they always had. It didn't feel right, though. I locked every door and window again, double-checking this time, and sat awake in the living room until the sun came up. The strangest part? The next day, it was like nothing had happened. No scratches on the walls, no tracks in the yard, no sign that anything had been there at all. Even the woods seemed normal again, birds chirping, squirrels running through the branches. But I know what I saw. I know what I heard. And every now and then, when the wind is just right, I swear I can hear that low, guttural noise echoing through the trees. I haven't seen the albino buck since that night, but I don't go near the woods anymore. The semi-truck chase. I've always loved road trips with my friends. There's something about being out on the open road, windows down, music blasting, and just letting go of everything for a while. That night, there were 4 of us: me, Jason, Claire, and Ethan, crammed into my old Honda Civic. We'd spent the day exploring small towns, grabbing greasy diner food, and making dumb jokes about the weird roadside attractions we passed. It was late, close to midnight, and we were on this long stretch of country road with no streetlights, just endless darkness and the occasional flash of headlights from passing cars. It was one of those moments where everything felt carefree and invincible. Until it didn't. It started when we got stuck behind this huge semi-truck. The thing was crawling at like 40 miles per hour on a road where you could easily go 60. Jason, being Jason, rolled down his window and shouted something stupid as we passed. Something like, "Move it, Grandpa." We all laughed, even though it was kind of dumb and unnecessary. But as we sped ahead, we noticed the truck's headlights growing brighter in the rear view mirror. At first, I thought it was just a coincidence, like maybe the driver decided to pick up the pace. But then he stayed on us. Every time I tried to put some distance between us, he sped up too, sticking close enough that I could see the outline of the massive grille in my mirror. That's when it stopped being funny. I told Jason to chill out, but he just laughed it off, saying the guy was probably just messing with us. Claire wasn't laughing, though. She was gripping the door handle so hard her knuckles turned white. "He's way too close," she said, her voice shaky. She was right. The truck's headlights filled the entire rear window, and I could hear its engine roaring louder every time I tried to speed up. I thought maybe if I pulled over, he'd pass us and be done with it, but as soon as I started slowing down, he blared the horn, this deafening guttural sound that made my chest tighten. It wasn't just a warning honk. It was like a threat. I floored it, my little car struggling to pick up speed on the narrow, curving road. The truck stayed right on us, swerving slightly from side to side like the driver was trying to intimidate us. Jason leaned out the window again, yelling something like, "What the hell is your problem?" I yelled at him to sit down and shut up, but the damage was already done. The truck responded by flicking its high beams on, flooding the car with blinding white light. I couldn't see anything ahead of us, just the faint outline of the road. My heart was pounding so hard I thought I might black out. The road started to twist and turn more sharply, and I knew I couldn't keep up this speed for long without risking a crash. My hands were clammy, slipping on the steering wheel, and every nerve in my body screamed at me to do something, anything, to get away. Ethan, who had been silent up until now, muttered, "We need to lose him." Easier said than done. There were no side roads, no turnoffs, just endless trees pressing in from both sides. I glanced at the gas gauge, half a tank. Not great, but enough to keep going. The truck's horn blared again, a long, menacing blast that rattled through the car. Claire was crying quietly in the back seat, and Jason had finally stopped laughing. Out of desperation, I took the next curve sharper than I should have, hoping the truck wouldn't be able to keep up. My tires squealed, the car shuddering as it hugged the edge of the road, but somehow we stayed on the pavement. For a second, I thought maybe we'd gained some distance. But then, in my rearview mirror, I saw the truck come barreling around the bend, faster than seemed possible for something that massive. Its headlights bobbed wildly, and for a horrifying moment, I thought it was going to tip over and crush us. Instead, it straightened out and surged forward, closing the gap. That's when I realized this wasn't just some pissed-off driver trying to scare us. He wanted to hurt us. At that point, my brain was in full panic mode, trying to think of a way out. There was no way I could outrun a semi on this road, not with the twists and the dips. My headlights barely lit the way ahead, and every shadow felt like it was hiding some new obstacle. Ethan suddenly yelled, "Kill the lights. Maybe he won't see us." It sounded insane, but we were out of options. I switched off the headlights and immediately regretted it. The world plunged into pitch black, and I had to rely on the faint glow of the moon to keep the car on the road. Behind us, The truck's high beams lit up the entire area, making it impossible to disappear completely. Still, I hoped it might confuse him enough to give us a chance. It didn't. The truck didn't slow down or swerve away. Instead, its horn blasted again, and it felt like the whole world was vibrating around us. Jason was freaking out now, shouting directions at me, like, "Go left." "No, right." "Faster." As if I wasn't already doing everything I could. Then, out of nowhere, we saw it, an old gravel road branching off to the right. It wasn't much, just a faint path cutting through the trees, but it was something. Without thinking, I yanked the wheel hard, the tires skidding as we veered onto the gravel. The car jolted violently, throwing everyone against their seats. Behind us, the truck's brakes screamed, and for a second, I thought it might follow us. The gravel road was even worse than I expected. Narrow, uneven, and full of potholes. My car wasn't built for this, and every bump felt like it was going to shake us apart. But for a moment, there was silence. No headlights behind us, no roaring engine, just the crunch of gravel under the tires and our panicked breathing. "Did we lose him?" Claire whispered, her voice barely audible. None of us answered, too afraid to even think it might be over. I kept driving, gripping the wheel so tight my fingers hurt, when suddenly the quiet was shattered by that horn again, blaring through the trees like some monstrous animal hunting us down. The headlights reappeared, cutting through the darkness like twin searchlights. He had followed us. Worse, the gravel road was too narrow to pick up any real speed, and the truck was gaining. The way the trees pressed in around us made it feel like we were being herded into a trap. Ethan was yelling something about ditching the car and running, but that felt even more insane. Where would we go? The woods were pitch black, and that driver, whoever he was, had already proved he wasn't just trying to scare us. He wanted us cornered. I pushed the car as fast as I dared, the engine whining in protest, but the truck just kept coming, relentless and unstoppable. The gravel road twisted sharply, and as I rounded a tight bend, the trees suddenly thinned out, revealing a clearing up ahead. For a split second, I felt a surge of hope. Maybe we'd find a way to escape. A house, another road, anything. But as we sped into the clearing, my heart sank. It was just an open field, surrounded by more woods, with no signs of life or civilization. Worse, the gravel road ended abruptly in a wall of tall grass and weeds. I slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a stop, dust and rocks flying everywhere. Behind us, the truck's headlights loomed closer, like a predator closing in on its prey. What do we do? Claire was sobbing now, her voice high-pitched and panicked. Jason kept swearing under his breath, while Ethan frantically unbuckled his seatbelt, muttering something about running for it. But before any of us could move, the truck's horn erupted again, so loud it felt like it shook the ground. The headlights blazed into the clearing, blinding us, and the massive vehicle came to a grinding halt just a few yards away. Its engine roared, idling angrily, as if daring us to make a move. For what felt like an eternity, none of us could breathe. The truck just sat there, its lights searing into the car, the sheer size of it making us feel completely helpless. Then, without warning, the truck revved its engine and lunged forward. I screamed and threw the car into reverse, but there was no time. The truck swerved at the last second, barely missing us, and barreled into the field. It plowed through the tall grass like it was nothing, kicking up dirt and debris as it went. We were frozen, watching as it circled the clearing, its headlights sweeping across us in wide arcs, like it was playing with us. Jason yelled, "Go! Get out of here!" But I couldn't move. My hands were glued to the wheel, my body paralyzed with fear. I kept thinking, this is it. This is how we die. The truck circled back toward us, slower this time, the engine rumbling like a growl. It stopped just a few feet away, its headlights directly on us again. We couldn't see inside the cab, just the blinding light and the faint outline of the grill. For a second, everything was still, like the world was holding its breath. Then, the driver did something that will haunt me forever. He turned off the headlights. Suddenly, we were plunged into darkness, the truck disappearing into the night. All we could hear was the low hum of the engine, idling just out of sight. That was somehow worse than seeing it. The pitch black made it feel like it could strike from anywhere. Ethan started screaming, "We need to go. Now!" And his panic snapped me out of my frozen state. I threw the car into gear and spun the wheel, trying to turn us around, but the gravel was loose and the tires struggled for traction. In the back of my mind, I kept expecting to hear the truck roar to life again, its headlights flooding us, but there was nothing. Just the crunch of my tires and the occasional creak of the car's suspension. That silence was suffocating. It felt like the truck was toying with us, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. As we finally managed to turn back toward the road, a sound cut through the night, a metallic clinking, like chains dragging across the ground. It wasn't loud, but in the stillness, it might as well have been a gunshot. Jason spun around in his seat, trying to see where it was coming from, but the darkness was absolute. "What the hell is that?" he hissed. I didn't answer. I couldn't. I just hit the gas, the car lurching forward as we sped back toward the gravel road. My chest felt like it was going to cave in, and every second I expected the truck to come barreling out of the woods behind us. We hit the gravel road at full speed, the car bouncing so violently I thought the suspension would give out. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half blinded by the dust cloud we were kicking up, but there was no sign of the truck. Jason kept twisting in his seat, muttering, "Where is it? Where the hell is it?" Like he was afraid to stop looking. Claire wasn't saying anything anymore. She was just staring straight ahead, her face pale as a ghost. I wanted to believe we'd lost it, but the way my stomach churned told me we weren't safe yet. Not even close. When we finally reached the main road, the relief was almost overwhelming. The smooth pavement felt like a lifeline, and for a few seconds, I thought we'd made it. But then, in the distance, I saw them, the truck's headlights. They appeared at the bend behind us, glowing faintly through the trees like some kind of predator stalking its prey. My heart sank. It was coming again, slower this time, like it was savoring the chase. "It's back," Ethan yelled, and I swear I felt my blood run cold. The truck stayed just far enough behind to keep us in its sights, its headlights flickering through the trees as it followed. I floored it, desperate to put as much distance between us and that truck as possible. The car's engine whined, struggling to keep up, but the truck didn't accelerate. It just kept its steady, menacing pace, like it knew we couldn't escape no matter how fast we went. Jason started yelling at me to call the cops, but my phone had no signal. None of ours did. It was like we were in some kind of dead zone, cut off from the rest of the world. Ethan was fumbling with his phone, swearing under his breath, while Claire sat in complete silence, tears streaming down her face. Then the truck's headlights flicked off again, plunging the road behind us into total darkness. For a split second, I thought it might have stopped. But then I saw it, just a shadow at first, huge and hulking, moving silently in the distance. My headlights caught a flash of metal as it emerged onto the road behind us. It wasn't trying to scare us anymore. It was hunting us, creeping closer with every second. I don't know what made me look ahead, but when I did, I saw it, another curve in the road, this one sharper than any we'd taken before. My stomach dropped. I had no choice but to slow down. I braked hard, the car screeching as I took the curve, praying the tires wouldn't give out. Gravel sprayed everywhere, and for a moment, I thought we'd lose control. But we made it around the bend. Barely. The truck wasn't so cautious. Its engine roared behind us, and I could hear the grinding of its tires skidding over the road. I thought this might be our chance, that it would overshoot the curve and we'd finally escape. But as we rounded the bend, the road straightened out, and there was nowhere else to go. The truck's horn blasted again, so loud it felt like my chest was going to explode. And then, nothing. I glanced in the mirror, expecting to see the truck charging toward us, but the road was empty. No headlights, no roaring engine, just darkness. "Where is it?" Jason whispered, his voice barely audible. None of us could answer. I kept driving, my hands trembling on the wheel, half expecting it to reappear at any moment. But it never did. We drove for another hour, not speaking, too afraid to stop or even slow down. When we finally reached a gas station on the edge of a small town, we stumbled out of the car, shaking and pale, trying to piece together what had just happened. To this day, I have no idea who was driving that truck or why they targeted us. Maybe it was just some psychopath looking for a thrill, or maybe there was no reason at all. I haven't been on a road trip since, and every time I see a semi-truck in my rearview mirror, my chest tightens and my hands start to sweat. Whatever that was out there on that dark road, it felt less like a person and more like something else, something relentless and unforgiving. Something that could have ended us that night if it had wanted to. The smiling incident. I never thought I'd be the one telling a story like this, but here we are. It happened 2 years ago, during my sophomore year of college. A group of us had gathered at one of those abandoned buildings near campus. You know the type, graffiti everywhere, windows broken, and an odd musty smell hanging in the air. We weren't there for anything sinister. It was just one of those late-night hangouts, fueled by boredom and a bit of alcohol. There were 6 of us, and we were all pretty close back then. Me, Jess, Marcus, Tasha, Leo, and Emma. Everything was fine until Leo found that damn bag. It was stuffed under a pile of old papers in a corner, just this clear plastic bag full of some white powder. None of us knew what it was, and honestly, none of us wanted to touch it, but of course, Leo being Leo, he had to grab it. At first, we all joked about it, saying stupid stuff like, "Hey, maybe it's flour," or "cocaine jackpot." But there was something about the bag that didn't feel right. It wasn't just the powder, it was where we found it. The corner where Leo picked it up was off. I know that sounds weird, but I swear the air in that part of the room felt heavier, like it was pressing down on me. Even Jess, who never spooks, mentioned it felt colder over there. We were all standing around the bag, arguing about whether we should call the cops or just leave it and go, when Marcus said, "Screw it, I'll open it." That's when the vibe shifted completely. Marcus didn't even get the bag fully open before Jess slapped it out of his hands, yelling, "Are you crazy?" The bag hit the floor, and a puff of the powder went into the air. That's when Emma started coughing like crazy, and for a second, we all panicked, thinking maybe it was toxic or something. But Emma waved us off, saying it was just the dust getting to her. It wasn't until later that I realized how wrong she was. Anyway, after that, everyone was on edge, and Leo, being the idiot he was, started joking about it being cursed. He even picked up the bag again and tossed it at Marcus, laughing. But the second Marcus caught it, his face changed. It was like, I don't know, like he wasn't fully there anymore. He just froze, staring at the bag, not blinking or saying anything. Then came the smile. It wasn't like a normal smile. This was wide, way too wide, and his eyes stayed completely still, not matching the grin on his face. I can't even explain how creepy it was. It looked unnatural, like his face wasn't meant to move that way. We all started freaking out, telling him to stop messing around, but he didn't say anything. He just stood there, holding the bag and smiling like that. Jess tried to grab it from him, but he yanked it back so hard she stumbled. That's when Emma said, "Guys, his nose is bleeding." And sure enough, a thin stream of blood was trickling down from both nostrils, but Marcus didn't even flinch. That's when it hit me. We needed to get the hell out of there. We tried to leave, but Marcus wouldn't budge. He just stood there, blocking the only way out, clutching that bag like his life depended on it. His smile never wavered, but his breathing got louder, almost like he was growling. I was terrified, and I could see everyone else was too. Jess was pleading with him, saying, "Marcus, come on, this isn't funny anymore. Let's go." But it was like he didn't even hear her. Leo, trying to act tough, stepped forward to grab him, but the second he touched Marcus's shoulder, Marcus let out this sound, a low, guttural laugh that didn't sound human. I swear, it was the kind of laugh that makes your stomach drop, like you've just heard something you weren't supposed to. Leo backed off immediately, muttering, "What the hell, man?" That's when Marcus's head tilted, just slightly, like he was listening to something none of us could hear. His smile somehow stretched even wider, and I swear his teeth looked sharper, though I might have just been imagining it. Then, without warning, he dropped the bag. The powder spilled everywhere, spreading in a thin white layer across the dirty floor. And Marcus, he just started walking, slowly, towards Tasha. She screamed, backing into the wall, and I thought he was going to hurt her, but he stopped right in front of her, leaning in so close their noses were almost touching. His voice came out low and shaky when he finally spoke. "It's so beautiful," he whispered. "Can't you see it?" None of us knew what to do. Tasha was frozen, tears streaming down her face, while Marcus just stood there, staring at her with that horrible grin. Leo finally snapped out of it and tried to pull Marcus away, but Marcus whipped around so fast it didn't seem possible. He shoved Leo back with this insane strength, sending him crashing into an old, rusted desk. Leo groaned, clutching his side, and I could see blood on his hand where he'd landed on something sharp. That was when Jess screamed, "We have to go." She grabbed Tasha's arm and dragged her toward the door, and I followed, pulling Emma behind me. But Marcus wasn't done. He started laughing again, louder this time, and the sound echoed through the room like it was bouncing off the walls. As we scrambled to get out, Marcus suddenly lunged at us. I swear, he moved like an animal, hands clawing at the air, his head jerking unnaturally. He didn't look like Marcus anymore. His face was pale, his lips cracked from that awful grin, and his eyes were wide and unblinking, like he wasn't even human. I slammed into the door, fumbling with the rusted handle, and finally managed to yank it open. We all spilled out into the hallway, panting and panicked, but Marcus didn't follow us. Instead, he stood in the doorway, just watching us with that same terrifying smile. Then he said something that chilled me to my core. "It's not done with me yet." His voice was distorted, deeper than it should have been, like something else was speaking through him. And then, as suddenly as it all started, he just stopped. Marcus just stood there, completely still, staring at us with that awful grin frozen on his face. None of us dared to move. The hallway was dimly lit, and his silhouette in the doorway looked distorted, like the shadows were playing tricks on us. Jess whispered, "We need to call someone," but none of us could bring ourselves to move. Then, as if a switch had been flipped, Marcus stepped back into the room, shut the door, and we heard the lock click. That sound, the metallic snap of the lock, sent chills down my spine. Jess tried to open it, banging on the door and yelling his name, but there was no response. Just silence, heavy and suffocating. Leo, still bleeding from his side, muttered, "Screw this, we're leaving." And honestly, I didn't blame him. We were all too freaked out to think straight. We half-dragged, half-carried him down the stairs, our footsteps echoing in the empty building. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting Marcus to come tearing after us, but he didn't. When we got outside, the fresh air hit me like a slap, and for a second, I thought maybe it was over. But as we stood there, catching our breath, Emma gasped. "Look," she whispered, pointing to one of the broken windows on the second floor. And there he was, Marcus, standing in the window, still smiling. His head was tilted again, and his eyes were locked on us. Then he raised his hand and waved, slow and deliberate. It was the most chilling thing I've ever seen. We didn't stick around after that. Leo was bleeding pretty badly, so we rushed him to the ER, making up some lie about him falling on broken glass. None of us mentioned Marcus or the bag of powder, not to the nurses, not to anyone. It felt like if we talked about it, whatever had happened back in that building would follow us. We stayed in the waiting room for hours, all of us too scared to leave or even look at each other for too long. When the doctor finally came out to tell us Leo was fine, Jess asked the question that had been on all our minds. Should we go back for Marcus? Nobody answered. The thought of walking back into that building made my stomach churn. But then, something even weirder happened. When we got back to campus the next morning, Marcus was there, sitting on a bench outside the library like nothing had happened. He looked normal. No blood, no creepy smile, just Marcus. Jess ran up to him, yelling, "Where the hell did you go last night?" He just stared at her, confused, like he didn't remember a thing. "What are you talking about?" he asked. "I went home early. I wasn't feeling well." I'll never forget the look on Jess's face. We all started arguing, trying to explain what had happened, but Marcus kept insisting he had no idea what we were talking about. And the way he said it, he sounded so sincere. It was like he really believed he hadn't been there. We were all too shaken to push it further, but something about the way Marcus acted didn't sit right with me. He seemed fine on the surface, laughing, joking, even making plans to hang out later, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't really him. His movements felt too smooth, too deliberate, like he was mimicking normal behavior. Jess must have felt it too because she pulled me aside later and whispered, "That's not Marcus." I didn't want to believe her, but deep down, I knew she was right. There was something missing in his eyes. They used to be so full of life, but now, they looked hollow like a doll's eyes. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Marcus's face, the smile, the blood, the way he'd waved at us from the window. Around 2 a.m., my phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. All it said was, "It's so beautiful." My stomach dropped, and I immediately thought of Marcus. I tried calling him, but his phone went straight to voicemail. The next morning, I found out Jess had gotten the same text. So had Emma and Tasha. None of us said it out loud, but we all knew it had to be connected to what happened in that building. The problem was, none of us had any answers, and the more we tried to forget, the harder it became. The texts kept coming, always at night, always the same message. "It's so beautiful." I stopped answering unknown numbers altogether, but even blocking them didn't work. It was like they came from nowhere. Jess swore she saw someone watching her from outside her dorm one night, but when she went to check, no one was there. Emma dropped out of school entirely a few weeks later, saying she needed to get away, though she wouldn't tell us where she was going. As for Marcus, he stayed completely normal. Too normal. He didn't seem bothered by any of it. Not the texts, not the powder, not what happened in that building. It was like the whole thing had never happened to him, but we all knew it had. The last straw for me happened about a month later. I was walking back from the library late at night, and I swear I heard someone behind me, footsteps echoing mine. I kept glancing back, but the path was empty. Still, the feeling of being watched wouldn't go away. When I finally made it to my dorm, I froze. Propped against my door was a small, clear plastic bag. It wasn't full like the one Marcus had found, but there was still some of that white powder inside. I didn't touch it. I couldn't. Instead, I grabbed my things and stayed with Jess that night. The next morning, the bag was gone. No one else saw it, no one believed me, but I know what I saw. And to this day, I wonder, was it a warning or an invitation? After that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever this was, it wasn't done with us. Jess and I tried to talk about it one last time, but it always led back to the same dead end. The bag, Marcus's behavior, and that strange text. Nothing added up. Marcus never brought it up again and acted like life was completely normal, which somehow made it even worse. The rest of us drifted apart not long after. Jess transferred schools, Leo stopped coming to classes, and Tasha avoided everyone. It was like none of us wanted to admit we'd been part of something we couldn't explain. But even though I haven't seen most of them in years, I know I'm not the only one who still feels it. Every so often, I'll get that same text again. It's so beautiful. Always from a different number, and always when I least expect it. I try to ignore it, but I can't. Sometimes I wonder if I should have stayed in that building, if I should have tried harder to stop Marcus, or if it wouldn't have made a difference. What scares me the most, though, is that I still see him in my dreams sometimes, standing in that broken window, smiling down at me. I'll wake up with that same sick feeling I had that night, like the air around me is heavier than it should be. And then I remember his words. It's not done with me yet. The truth is, I don't think it's done with any of us.